Think about how full I am with emotion, not just for George Floyd, but the many African Americans that have suffered the same fate as George Floyd. I'm thinking about protests in my country, 'tis the sweet land of liberty, the equality expressed in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that I've sworn my adult life to support and defend. I'm thinking about a history of racial issues and my own experiences that didn't always sing of liberty and equality. I'm thinking about how my nomination provides some hope, but also comes with a heavy burden.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, the man you just heard from, General Charles Q. Brown Jr., known as General C.Q. Brown, delivered that message about how complicated his feelings were in the moment, about being an African-American man in this country and a member of the United States military. Just a few months prior, General Brown had been nominated by Donald Trump to be the next chief of staff for the U.S. Air Force. And 3 years after that, very different president of a different party, President Joe Biden, nominated him to the role of chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the United States military's top officer. However, General C.Q. Brown was late Friday night fired by Donald Trump without any reason given and before his 4-year term was up. Illuminating reporting in the New York Times reports that Trump never got over that video we just played you of General Brown. It's something he recorded in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And in trying to understand this decision, let's listen to what the man who now sits atop the Defense Department, Pete Hegseth, said a few months ago.
The dumbest phrase on planet Earth in the military is our diversity is our strength. You got to fire, you got to fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and you got to fire this. I mean, obviously, you're going to bring in a new Secretary of Defense, but any general that was involved, general, admiral, whatever that was involved in any of the DEI woke, it's got to go.
Any general involved in that has got to go. That wasn't it, though. He wrote a book. It was published last year, and he says this of General Brown's promotion to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, quote, "Was it because of his skin color or his skill? We'll never know, but always doubt," which on its face seems unfair to CQ. But since he has made the race card one of his biggest calling cards, it doesn't really much matter. General Brown's firing was part of a Friday night purge of military brass that Trump and Pete Hegseth deemed unable to carry out Donald Trump's agenda. The first woman to ever lead the Navy, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, and General James Slife, the Vice Chief of Staff at the Air Force, were also fired, along with 3 JAGs, Judge Advocate Generals of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. One of our next guests, Stephen Lepper, who served as Deputy Legal Counsel to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, puts it like this, quote, "Lying beneath the flowery Pentagon press release and official social media posts praising the officers for their service are sinister, reckless motives that should scare every American. A desire to remove any legal guardrail that might prevent the military from doing the president's bidding without question, and a total lack of understanding of how military leaders are made and what military leaders do." What some are calling a Friday night massacre at the U.S. military is where we start the hour. Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times, Helene Cooper, joins us. She's byline on that New York Times reporting we read from. Also joining us, as we mentioned, retired U.S. Air Force Major General Stephen Lepper, who was a Deputy Judge Advocate General in the Air Force, and retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel, founder of Democratic Majority Action PAC. Amy McGrath is here. Eddie's still with us. Helene, take us through the reporting.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks for having me. You know, I sat down on Saturday. Friday night was crazy as we got the news. We'd been sort of anticipating this for a while. And I sat down on Saturday and watched that video that you opened the segment with again. And I watched it about 4 or 5 times because I wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything in there where, in which, it's so easy to call him CQ, where General Brown had gone off on a more of a pro-diversity rant, and there wasn't. The video that you played is a very personal story. It runs for 4 minutes and 49 seconds, in which he is talking about his own life as an African-American fighter pilot in the Air Force. He talks about how he going to schools, elementary school with his sister, where they were the only two black kids in the whole school, and he felt like they didn't fit in. And then he talks about how when he was at a school with 50% minorities, he still felt like he didn't fit in. He talks about how when he was in the Air Force, he had black friends who came up to him and said, "Why are you hanging out with your squadron members? Most of them, they're all white, instead of hanging out with us." He talks about just, you know, trying to navigate these two worlds. And it's not the sort of thing that most people would find offensive, but it did really, really anger both President Trump, because when it landed right after, it was in the middle, it was like on June 4th, I think, it was like a few days after the George Floyd killing, it electrified the Pentagon at the time, the rank and file, and also the officers. And we were in the middle, if you just cast your mind back to that time, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we're in the middle of this big, huge social justice movement, and Trump was very, very angry about these Black Lives Matter protests that were going on in the streets. He was already angry at his Pentagon, at his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, Mark Milley, and even his defense secretary, who had been much more pliable than the one before, Mark Esper, who both stood up to him and said, "No, you can't use the Insurrection Act to put active duty military on the streets against these Black Lives Matter protesters." And he felt like he was being stymied. And then C.Q. Brown, who he had just nominated to be the Air Force chief, comes out with this video, which on the face of it is pretty innocuous, but it really angered Trump, and it really angered the MAGA world. And when Pete Hegseth starts writing in his book, and when he wrote in his book, The War on Warriors, that C.Q. Brown needed to be fired because he said, the quote was, and you just read that out loud, he said he has made race his biggest calling card. It's that video he's talking about.
Is it true, though? I mean, what is he known for among the military men and women, Helene?
No, it's not. It's not true. I mean, if you C.Q. Brown is still the same person who Trump nominated as the Air Force chief of staff in 2020 before he made that video. There's one other thing that that some of the Trump allies and the Hegseth allies point to, and that's a 2022 memo in which the Air Force, C.Q. Brown, the Air Force Secretary at the time, Frank Kendall, and other officials asked that the applicant pool, not the people who were actually hired, but that they asked that the applicant pool, the people who actually applied, be more reflective of America. And they put numerical targets. They wanted African Americans, they wanted Asian Americans, they wanted women, and they didn't meet any of those. They didn't meet those goals, but they wanted to make more of an effort to reach out to more underserved, underrepresented communities at the Pentagon. And the Trump people didn't like that either. But that's it. You noted earlier that when on Friday night, when the notice finally came out that C.Q. Brown was being fired, there's no reason given. It's just, when you talk to the Trump people afterwards, and when we talk to them afterwards, they all say it's because the president wanted his own team, he wanted to bring his own people in. Well, the military is supposed to be like the FBI. It's not supposed to be, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is supposed to be a position that spans both, two administrations, so that you have that level of continuity, and that you're also able to credibly say that the American military is apolitical. You're not going to become president and then fire all the Democrats in the military. That would be, it's the same, similar to the FBI. But President Trump, I guess, does not really necessarily see it that way.
Steve, Senator Jack Reed making some of those points, tying Friday night's purge to the FBI choices. Let me play that for you.
They put Kash Patel as the FBI director, who is a partisan, who has no, I think, respect for the traditions of neutrality of the FBI. And now they've turned to DOD, and they want everyone in DOD to be holding to the president, not to the Constitution. They want everyone there to do what they're told, regardless of the law. What was also startling over the weekend was firing all the advocate generals of the military. If you're going to break the law, the first thing you do is you get rid of the lawyers. It's the beginning of a very, very serious degradation of the military and politicization of the military.
Steve, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Senator Reid. This is not unprecedented. General officers, when you are given your stars, after you earn your stars, know that at any time the president can ask for you to give those stars back. And so these events on Friday night are not unprecedented, but what is unprecedented is the fact that all of these general officers, flag officers share one thing in common, and that is either a lack of connection with the ideology, the political and social ideology of this administration, or they are perceived as products of that ideology, of course, being diversity. I served for 35 years in the Air Force, and I had a front row seat to the evolution of the military in terms of its diversity. It didn't start with C.Q. Brown. It started arguably with Harry Truman when he desegregated the military 75 years ago, last year. And it continued on through allowing women to go to the service academies. I happened to be a member of the last class of all male cadets at the Air Force Academy. And it continued even beyond that to Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, which occurred almost 15 years ago. And I happened to be part of the comprehensive review working group at the Pentagon that studied the issue of allowing gays to serve openly in the military and reported to the President and the Secretary of Defense the time was right to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So it's not a question of whether we should promote or oppose diversity in the military. It is a fact that the military is diverse. And what General Brown is noted for being able to do very effectively as a military leader is to understand that diversity and to take care of his people by respecting their diversity and understanding their diversity and basically leveraging his understanding of their diversity to making them the most effective fighting force that we can produce.
Steve, talk about the targeting and firing of the JAG officers. Why was that so essential to turning the Pentagon into a more political institution?
Well, what really bothers me about that whole situation is what Secretary Hegseth said over the weekend in providing his rationale for his decision to remove the 3 judge advocates general. And he basically referred to them as roadblocks. Judge advocates, what Secretary Hegseth is trying to do is presumably create a warrior ethos or restore a warrior ethos that he believes has somehow been lost in the military. And part of that warrior ethos apparently is that JAGs should not be permitted to serve as roadblocks on the battlefield. There are several problems with that. The roles of JAGs on the battlefield are really 2. The first, and one of them, and perhaps the most important, is that we provide advice to commanders on the legal limits of the application of military force. There are U.S. laws and international laws that do govern the effective prosecution of military power on the battlefield. And the second role of a JAG is to administer the military justice system. Again, we serve as advisors to commanders on issues having to do with violations of those laws. And commanders decide whether or not to punish people who are guilty of violating those laws. punish them under the UCMJ. And inherent in both of those roles is the JAGs' role in identifying and distinguishing between lawful and unlawful orders. And if you don't have JAGs on the battlefield, if you decapitate the military legal system by removing the Judge Advocates General, then the message that you're sending to JAGs, to commanders, to all military troops who serve is that we're not going to listen to JAGs anymore. And frighteningly, an extension of that is that we're not going to follow the law anymore.
Amy, it's so haunting to hear it out loud. But this is not a new phenomenon for Hegseth and Trump. Hegseth, as a Fox News Weekend morning show anchor, championed Trump's intervention in the military justice system during his first presidency.
Well, that's right. And I wrote a piece in the first Trump administration about his pardoning war criminals and the message that that sends to the troops who are serving. It's the same message. You can commit crimes on the battlefield and not be held accountable. And again, that's a scary proposition.
I want to bring Amy McGrath in on this. Amy, what are you hearing from folks inside the Pentagon?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is really, really dangerous. And as the general just said, you know, and I'm glad that we're actually talking about it, because a lot of us, especially in the security world, we didn't want to talk about this for a long time. Remember, Nicole, during the last Trump administration, Trump asked the Secretary of Defense why he could not shoot protesters in the leg using our military. And we had a Secretary of Defense then who was a man of honor who basically said, Mr. President, we cannot do that. What is he doing now? With this purge, and let's call it a purge, it's a litmus test, it's a purge, it's a personal loyalty test. He wants to replace these leaders with people who are more loyal to him than to the Constitution. And I think we need to discuss the fact that if you replace leaders who will then be more inclined to use the military, perhaps against our own people, which I never thought I would say this, and then, as the general just pointed out, you replace the JAGs, those are the lawyers that would then say, hey, you can't do this. You replace them, put them new people in who could now justify these unethical, potentially illegal orders, justify them as legal. That is a move in the wrong direction, and it is something that every American needs to be worried about right now.
I want to press you on that. There is a very clear sign that Americans have received the memo that a lot of what's happening is not what they thought they were going to get. Some of us feel like we tried to warn them, but that's for another day. I'm going to ask all of you to stick around. I have to sneak in a quick break. We'll have much more from everyone here on the Purge Friday night at the Pentagon and the dangerous things it put in motion. Also ahead, 3 years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Donald Trump and his most senior aides refused to publicly blame Vladimir Putin for what Vladimir Putin did, started the war in Ukraine. Today, the president of France came to Washington to try to save decades of alliances. I'll tell you how that went later in the hour. And some breaking news to tell you about. A judge has temporarily denied the Associated Press's request to reinstate their access to events happening at the White House. In a hearing this afternoon, the Trump-appointed judge, Trevor McFadden, asked for a fuller briefing before he makes a final decision on whether to order the government to rescind their access, all over the AP's unwillingness to call the body of water bordering several southern U.S. states the Gulf of America. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
I'm thinking about my Air Force career, where I was often the only African American in my squadron, or as a senior officer, the only African American in the room. I'm thinking about wearing the same flight suit with the same wings on my chest as my peers, and they being questioned by another military member, are you a pilot? I'm thinking about how I sometimes felt my comments were perceived to represent the African American perspective, when it's just my perspective informed by being African American. I'm thinking about the pressure I felt to perform error-free, especially for supervisors I perceive had expected less from me as an African American. I think about having to represent by working twice as hard to prove their expectations and perceptions of African Americans were invalid. I'm thinking about the airmen that have lived through similar experiences and feelings as mine, or who were either consciously or unconsciously unfairly treated.
Eddie.
Yeah, you know, as I watch the video, it angers me, it incenses me, you know. Baldwin has this wonderful, powerful, insightful line in Many Thousands Gone that we have to make our faces blank in order to wash away your guilt. That the precondition for us to enter the room is that we have to leave the particularity of who we are at the door. That we're constantly having to prove to people that we are not just human beings, but we're talented, that we bring skill sets, that we have capacities, and people imagine racial justice as a charitable and philanthropic enterprise, something that they possess to give to us, and when they change their minds, they could take it all back, and then we have to prove ourselves again and again. So you hear his voice. He's trying to come to terms with the fact that George Floyd, right, he has to speak to it because he has to speak to his son. He has to speak to all of those men and women in the service, in the Air Force. And the likes of Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump find it abhorrent because he refuses to leave his feelings at the door. And here we are again, Nicole. Again. We talked about it in El Paso. We talked about it in Buffalo. We talked about, that's the evil. That's the consequence. We're here again. It's the tragic loop. And so my son will have to deal with this nonsense as I have to deal with it. It just incenses me at every level.
He said this, I feel the pressure to perform error-free.
Yeah, you have to prove that you belong in these spaces. By definition, I'm an affirmative action baby. And the only reason why you think that is because of assumptions about who I am. Because if it wasn't for affirmative action, I wouldn't be here. Because of the beliefs and commitments you have. Because of what the country is. Right? And there's always this underlying question of our loyalty to the country, of whether or not we're really Americans and all of this nonsense, right? And you just kind of have to, in some ways, keep that intolerable bitterness of spirit. You have to beat it back, right? Because these people want to insist that I remain at the bottom of the well so they can be their conception of what it means to be a white American. They require me to be the N-word so they can be white. They demand it.
Could you imagine a black man being Secretary of Defense who was the subject of a police report in Monterey County of an allegation of rape, or rumored by 10 of his colleagues at Fox News to be drinking up to and including 1 hour before air?
Hell no. Can you imagine a black man with 34 felony accounts being the president of the United States? Of course not. This is the country by circumstance, by birth, that is mine, but it is so deeply, deeply and profoundly flawed. And here we are in the midst of a betrayal once again. And people who look like me, I could imagine Lisa Franchetti and her family, we have to beat back the bitterness and fight for the country we so desperately want.
And I guess, Helene, that's where the rubber will meet the road. The men and women of the military are as diverse. Actually, it's the most diverse workforce in the country, not just in the federal government, but it is the most diverse workforce in the country. And it's being led by a man who says, quote, I reject the idea that our diversity is our strength. What is your read on the morale of the men and women of the military?
It's hard to say because it's still a little early. I can tell you that the people of color in the military you're looking at a really low morale. So many of them have talked to me about both the desire to leave and the determination in a couple of cases with people I talked to over the weekend that they would stay, that Donald Trump was not going to drive them out of the Pentagon. You talk about how diverse the military is, and it is 43% people of color, but that is all it has always been at the lower levels. At the top levels of the military, it has been white male for as long as we can remember. There were a couple of blips in the past where you had Colin Powell, who was the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but up until through the Trump administration, you had so few women, black, Hispanic, Asian American, in the driver's seat or in positions of power. There was a now kind of infamous photo that was tweeted in October 2019 after Donald Trump, then president, met with the senior Pentagon leadership. And it's a photo of Trump with 34 white men. There are no women in that photo. There are no brown people in that photo. And this was the Pentagon leadership at the time. Soon after that, some months after that, Donald Trump did promote C.Q. Brown to be the Air Force chief. And then President Biden came in. The George Floyd movement started, but then President Biden came in, and you had, for the first time, he appointed Lloyd Austin to be the Secretary of Defense. Lloyd Austin was leading the Pentagon with Mark Milley for the rest of Milley's term, and then C.Q. Brown was promoted to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with about a year and 4 months ago. So for the first time in its history, you had the 1.3 million active duty troops of the American military being led by 2 black men. And at that point, I think a lot of the Trump allies and a lot of the right-wing Republicans who make up the Trump base really didn't like that. I think they went in some ways nuts, and that's when you started hearing so much about woke and about diversity being suddenly now it's a bad thing. It's just it's sad, but I think the morale at the Pentagon, among the young men and women who make up our military, it's I don't think it's going to be. I don't think it's very high right now. The people I've talked to, maybe that's self-selecting. I don't know. The people I talked to have been pretty upset about it. But there also seems to be some kind of determination that they're not going to just drop everything and walk away, which I think is pretty interesting too. The time we will know what kind of effect this has with recruiting when we see the recruiting numbers in the months to come.
Amy McGrath, I want to give you the last word, and I just want to broaden this to General Mark Milley, who also invited such deep rage from Trump and MAGA for saying this sentence, quote, "I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it." And it was in the context of wanting to understand why so many white men and women stormed the United States Capitol on January 6th. He's someone that Donald Trump accused of, quote, treason, a crime punishable by death.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I think, and it's bigger than just recruiting. I mean, the military is run by people who you want to keep. So it's not just people that when we look at how is this going to affect, it's not just people coming in, it's what kind of leaders are we going to keep in our military? But I want to take it just as the last word. We focus on diversity, and that's important. But these recent purges, we also have to focus on the fact that he could easily put people who are yes men in these key positions. And that is what is unprecedented. It's unprecedented not only in terms of the potential for domestic use of the military here at home, but also the fact that you do not get good counsel from people who are yes men. And we're talking about, potentially invading Panama, and he's talking about Greenland and all these stupid things like bombing Mexico. And who is our military led by? I think we also have to really think about that as we look at this Saturday night or Friday night very dishonorable way that Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump got rid of those senior military officers.
And we will stay on this story with all of your help. Helene Cooper, Major General Steve Lepper, Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath, and Eddie Glaude, thank you all so much for spending this time with us today. When we come back, the president of France forced to fact-check Donald Trump in real time on TV at the White House as Trump and his top aides continue to lie about and refuse to tell the truth and blame Russia for starting the war in Ukraine 3 years ago. That's next. Today marks 3 years since Vladimir Putin launched a deadly and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is Europe's largest military conflict since World War II, with Ukraine losing tens of thousands of troops and Russia losing hundreds of thousands. That's according to the New York Times. Despite the atrocities inflicted on the Ukrainians at the hands of Moscow, the Trump administration has left little doubt that they are taking Putin's side. Just take a listen to Trump's Secretary of Defense and National Security Advisor over the weekend.
But fair to say, Russia attacked unprovoked into Ukraine 3 years ago tomorrow.
Fair to say it's a very complicated situation.
Can you acknowledge that Russia is the aggressor here?
Well, you know what? Who would you rather having go toe-to-toe with the likes of Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, Xi, or anyone else? Joe Biden or Donald Trump? He's the deal maker in chief.
Today at the White House, French President Emmanuel Macron met with Donald Trump to try to convince the United States that it is in their interest and the world's interest for the United States to stand up to Putin. And at one point, Macron had to correct Trump on the nature of Europe's support for Ukraine.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear.
Joining our coverage, Ambassador Michael McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, MSNBC international affairs analyst. Also joining us, senior correspondent for Time Magazine, covering international affairs, author of The Showman, Inside the Invasion That Shook the World and Made a Leader Out of Vladimir Zelensky. Simon Schuster's here. Let me start with you, Simon, on Zelensky's ability to constantly change the equation, offering over the weekend to step down in exchange for NATO membership for Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, he has to also answer to his people. You know, he's negotiating with Donald Trump, but a lot of what he's been saying in standing up to Trump and in telling him that he's not going to sign these onerous draft agreements that Trump is putting in front of him, you know, he's answerable to his own people. And I think he's done a pretty strong job so far of telling the Ukrainian people that, look, I'm not going to sign away the natural resources that belong not to the president of Ukraine, but to the people of Ukraine and future generations. So that took a lot of courage, I think, given the importance of the relationship with the United States. And what it's created here in Kyiv, you know, talking to officials and just regular people here, is a kind of rally around the leader effect, where a lot of the tensions that had begun to emerge between different political forces here have quieted down. And people now feel that while Zelensky is continuing to fight the war against Russia, he's also now standing up to what is supposed to be Ukraine's closest and most important ally, the United States. So that's been interesting to see here in the last couple of days. But I think now it feels like to many Ukrainians, their president and their leadership is fighting on two fronts: a diplomatic war with Ukraine's would-be closest ally, and of course continuing to fight the Russians.
How bizarre is it, Ambassador McFaul, to have an American president on the world stage trying to take another country's natural resources?
Bizarre is a polite word. Sad, tragic. For me as an American, it's embarrassing. Taking advantage of a country that needs us. And I do applaud what President Zelensky is doing. Like Simon said, he's maneuvering this, and he's becoming very popular back home. That is very clear. So if Trump wanted to make him popular and help him for re-election, it's having that effect. But I just got to say, this is not just embarrassing. It's not in America's national interest. Trump is alienating the entire free world by imposing these kinds of deals like this. And this makes us look weak. It makes us look like we don't care about values. And that's not my America, Nicole. That's not the America I believe in. We just want to do deals and we want to be reimbursed. By the way, the American people didn't ask to be reimbursed. They voted their representatives in Congress. Congress passed those legislative packages that led to that assistance. The president signed it. There's no clause that says, and now you have to pay us back. So I think the president actually is out of step with a lot of Americans on this issue.
I mean, I'll play the role of the political analyst for the purposes of conversation. He is. 61% of all Americans understand the truth that Russia is responsible for the war in Ukraine, which is why you have Maria Bartiromo holding the line on who started the war. When you've lost Maria Bartiromo and you're a Republican and a Trump official, you are off the cliff. And then Quinnipiac has an overwhelming majority of Americans who don't trust Vladimir Putin. 81% of all Americans don't think Putin should be trusted, yet that's who Donald Trump is throwing in with. How does Zelensky view this bizarre sort of hijacking of the American presidency in terms of ideology and priorities as someone who doesn't even have the American people behind him on the question of Ukraine, Simon?
I mean, it's extremely painful, and you have to understand what the Ukrainians are dealing with in parallel. Just, the last couple of nights, there have been hundreds of these Russian drones. These are terrifying machines. They fly in swarms in the middle of the night. Each of them sounds like basically a motor scooter revving its engine as it falls out of the sky. At the same time, you have, anti-aircraft weapons on the Ukrainian side trying to shoot these things down. And at the same time, you have the incoming fire from Donald Trump and many people in his administration calling the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian president, a dictator and blaming the Ukrainians for supposedly starting the war. I mean, it's a gut punch. And the way that the Ukrainians have been dealing with it, President Zelensky is dealing with it, is to stay calm, try to slow the process down. He's been getting a lot of different kinds of advice, including today, some of the officials I talked to, they're saying, okay, let's slow down. And if Trump wants this piece of paper that says, okay, we got a deal from the Ukrainians, now they're paying us, we're not paying them. Let's give him that, if that will continue some form of American aid, but let's at least make sure that this agreement, if we sign it, if the Ukrainians sign it, isn't completely onerous and colonial in nature. So that's what they're negotiating over now.
It's an insane turn of events on many fronts. But in this case, there is zero mandate from the American people to capitulate to Vladimir Putin and Russia. I want to press both of you on the Russian side of this. No one's going anywhere. We have to sneak in a short break. We'll all be right back.
Essentially, this is President Trump surrendering to the Russians. This is not a statesman or a diplomat. This is just someone who admires Putin, does not believe in the struggle of the Ukrainians, and is committed to cozying up to an autocrat.
Ambassador McFaul, there is no U.S. interest served in capitulating to Putin. What happens after Trump takes the entire country over this cliff with him?
First, to the earlier segment, I wanted to say something. One of the Trump officials said, he's the deal guy. He's the guy that makes all the deals. He hasn't made any deals. He had 4 years to make deals. He amended one trade agreement with the Canadians and the Mexicans. Everything else, there was no deals. No Russia, North Korea. This is a myth that he is a deal maker. And you're seeing it right now. It's just capitulation. I've negotiated with these guys, with Lavrov and Ushakov. Guys who are in Saudi Arabia, you got to bring your A game to negotiate with them and get something. And they're not doing that. They're just offering things. And I think the main reason is that Trump actually doesn't care about a peace agreement with Ukraine. He just wants to have a cozy, close relationship with Putin. I hope I'm wrong, but the evidence suggests that that's his focus. And what the actual specifics of a deal is, he doesn't care, because if the Ukrainians don't sign it, they'll just walk away and say, well, I gave them a deal, they didn't sign up, and now let's get on with the real business, which is to get close to Putin.
I mean, Ambassador McFaul, I believe that's true of Trump. But when you take people like Marco Rubio, who as recently as a week ago, or Lindsey Graham, who I think 9 days ago said to Zelensky's face in Germany, you're the best kind of American ally. You're at war shooting bullets at our adversaries so we don't have to. When you see them fall in line behind Trump, who's capitulating not just to Putin, the guy he wants to be like, but Putin, who awarded the soldiers who carried out atrocities in Bucha, what are you looking for from men like Marco Rubio?
That's a great question. I think it's the only question that matters, because we know what Trump does. He's, he just tweets and disengages. What we really need to see is leadership from Marco Rubio, Secretary of State Rubio, from National Security Advisor Mike Wallace. They know that Putin invaded Ukraine 3 years ago today. They know that is a fact, and the fact that they won't say it on television is shocking to me. Why do you do these jobs if you have to sell your soul and not actually pursue things that you believe in? But I want to give them a second chance. I hope they got off to a horrible start. They gave the Russians everything. I hope they regroup, and I hope they think about a strategy that actually could end this war, because if they don't, historians are not going to be kind to them.
Ambassador Michael McFaul and Simon Schuster, thank you both so much for spending time with us on this. We have to sneak in one more break. We'll be right back. The measles outbreak in Texas we reported on last week has now spread to New Mexico, with now 9 reported cases, adding to the 90 cases in Texas. 16 of those patients have been hospitalized. The outbreak is gaining national attention, causing bipartisan concern. Republican Senator Bill Cassidy, who is himself a doctor and who voted to confirm Robert Kennedy Jr., tweeted this, quote, "Please make sure your child is up to date on vaccines. Measles is highly contagious and serious." Very different tune for him. As we said, he voted to confirm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the Health and Human Services Secretary less than 2 weeks ago. We'll stay on this story. Another break for us. We'll be right back.